We affirm our sole point of contention is innovation. Charles Duhigg, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist at the New York Times, writes in 2018, that antitrust has always been about progress. Antitrust prosecutions are part of how technologies grow. They are a tool that societies use to help startups build a monopolist breakthrough without, in the process, being crushed by monopolists. If those startups prosper and make discoveries of their own, they eventually become monopolies themselves, and the cycle starts anew. Antitrust law has been the key to maintaining a virtuous cycle of American economic growth. Tim Wu, an antitrust expert at Columbia University, writes in 2018, oversized, inefficient firms can persist for decades, effectively immunized from the need to improve products. That monopoly can be an inefficient form, as was a lesson from the Standard Oil case, where the breakup of the oil industry was a boon to its further expansion. The breakup of the original film trust sparked the rise of the American film industry, and in more recent times, the campaigns against AT&T and IBM sparked a momentous boom in telecommunications and computing industries. However, that cycle has been broken. According to the New York Times in 2018, enforcement of the anti-monopoly laws is falling. Between 1970 and 1999, the U.S. brought about 50 in monopoly cases each year. But between 2000 and 2014, that number went down to 50. The decline of antitrust enforcement has enabled a new generation of corporations, this time in the information technology sector, to rise and achieve total control. As The Guardian reports in 2018, today, 90% of internet searches are via Google. 94% of young people who use social media have a Facebook profile. Just 1% of smartphones use an operating system that isn't iOS or Android made by Apple or Google. With lax enforcement of antitrust laws, these companies have kept competitors out through monopolistic business practices. Journalist Asher Schechter writes in her 2018 book for the Stigler Center, startups effectively have no chance of competing against the tech giants. Startups that operate in areas coveted by tech giants face a choice: sell or get crushed. The big five tech companies have made over 436 acquisitions in the last decade, with no challenge from antitrust authorities. When startups refuse to sell, they find themselves facing an unlevel playing field. Snapchat, which turned down a $3 billion acquisition offer from Facebook in 2013, is case in point. After it failed to acquire Snapchat, Facebook simply cloned many of Snapchat's features, using its vast reach to completely undercut its growth. As a result, investors and entrepreneurs are now wary of entering into direct competition with giants like Google and Facebook. The very notion that someone could start a new search engine that competes with Google is just laughed at by the venture capital community, says venture capitalist Albert Wenger. The rise of digital platforms has been correlated with historic decline in startups. Wenger furthers that new business formation in the U.S. has declined by more than 40% since the 70s and is at a near 40-year low. Hurting startups hurts innovation. The Economist explains in a 2011 article that although big companies often excel in incremental innovations, adding more bells and whistles to existing products, they are less comfortable with the disruptive innovations, the kind that change the rules of the game. The big companies often bury new ideas that threaten established business lines. The best ideas start small, spread widely, and then transform entire systems. Facebook began as a way for students at a single university to keep in touch. Now it has 2 billion users. Innovation is key for economic growth. Andrea O'Sullivan of the Mercatus Center writes in March that technological innovation brings benefits. It increases productivity and brings citizens new and better goods and services that improve their overall standard of living. Thus, he finds that technological innovation is a key driver of economic growth and human well-being. Antitrust cases have historically enabled massive economic growth by allowing startups to flourish. A McKinsey report explains that by creating new markets, the advent of the personal computer, driven by the AT&T antitrust case, created 18.5 million jobs. Thus, we're very proud to affirm.
Can we see one card?
Yeah.
Empirically, antitrust build more startups. This was the last card you read. I think McKinsey.
Yeah.
Yeah, McKinsey is not saying that it built more startups.
Oh, okay.
It's talking about the computer technology and the benefits of that.
Okay, that's fine.
Still on that? Okay.
Is everyone ready? Jackson and I negate the resolution. Our sole contention is pulling the plug on open source software. Christopher Johnson from the Wharton School of Business at UPenn writes in 2019 that large tech firms have been the driving force behind enhancing the quality of life in the digital age, offering services and resources at the discretion of consumer convenience. Google and Facebook offer services for free to consumers, while Amazon, Microsoft, and Apple are locked in a price war for cloud computing, offering the best experience and price for the public. This is because Lowry from the University of Virginia in 2019 explains that large tech firms retain mass amounts of capital, allowing them to prioritize consumers first. Problematically, enforcing antitrust regulations would directly drain technology giants of this capital in two distinct ways. First is extracting financial settlements. McAfee of Caltech writes in 2004 that firms attack rivals through the strategic use of antitrust lawsuits designed to extract hefty financial settlements. Empirically, these federal suits are financially destructive to tech companies. Lore of the New York Times in 2009 finds that tech giant Intel resolved an antitrust suit against its rival AMD for over $1 billion. Antitrust litigation allows financial settlements to continuously compound, as Levine of the Business Insider in 2015 writes that if a single plaintiff who is filing a suit believes the settlement is too low, tech firms are forced to increase their offer, allowing for financial exploitation. Second is plummeting investment. Biddlingmeyer of the Cato Institute in 2001 explains that antitrust cases increase uncertainty and lower expected financial returns for investors. The uncertainty of legal rulings spooks investors, causing them to pull out of the market. Biddlingmeyer quantifies that every additional antitrust suit against a company reduces investment by $1.7 billion. Empirically, this is true, as Kinsella of the Street found that immediately after the Supreme Court ruled against Microsoft in the landmark antitrust case, the company's investments plunged. For these two reasons, every case of antitrust litigation against technology giants would have crippling financial repercussions. Worryingly, affirming magnifies this consequence further, as McAfee writes that antitrust suits uniquely enforced by the federal government often bring a swarm of private plaintiffs, multiplying the effect of draining capital. This loss in capital has a devastating effect on open source software, which is free and publicly accessible software for developers or corporations to contribute and learn from in all aspects of digital tech. Rowley from the University of Chicago in 2017 confirms that absent capital flows, large tech firms would be unable to support the continued development of open source software, as they would isolate resources on profitable initiatives, triggering two impacts. The first is destroying small businesses. Open source projects are helping small businesses all over the world to save time and money. Gregory of the Balance writes in 2019 that because open source requires no financial investment and frequently has the flexibility to fit perfectly with a business owner's needs, small businesses have thrived off access to the open source. For this reason, Razavi of The Guardian in 2016 writes that 78% of small businesses utilize open source software to stay afloat. Halting the development of open source projects would subsequently endanger the viability of small businesses. This is devastating, as Nagal from the University of Southern California in 2017 writes that every 1% increase in open source usage increases capital to small businesses by $100,000. The second impact is entrenching poverty. Fuhrer from the Technology Innovation Management Review in 2010 writes that free and open source software is key to solving the largest problems facing humanity. Matheson of MIT in 2016 confirms that the spread of open source financial services by Microsoft has helped raise 194,000 Kenyan households out of extreme poverty. However, there is much work to be done, as the IFMA in 2017 concludes that open source programs developed by tech giants like Microsoft could exponentially financially impact 2 billion people in developing nations. Thus, we negate.
Can we see the 78% of small businesses use
Open source? Yep.
And then the evidence about Kenya and open source.
Sure. So two parts highlighted in blue. Razavi is 78% of small businesses is open source, and Matheson is Kenya.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you. About 15 seconds each.
Ready? So you say in your case that open source is good because it's free
free for small companies to access.
Well, so what cost does it impose for a big company to put like their algorithm online?
Sure, so I can give you an example of one form of open source. Linux costs $1.2 billion to develop every single year.
Sure.
That's how much it would
That's fair, but what does it cost a company to copy and paste that online?
No, it's not copy and pasting it online, it's developing the software continuously for small businesses to utilize. That's the argument we're making.
Wait, that doesn't make sense. Like, wait, hold on. So your argument is that big companies specifically make code for small businesses?
They make code that is open source for small businesses, for things like other countries.
Exactly. So my question to you is, how much does it cost to put that online?
It doesn't cost anything to put it.
Obviously, it doesn't cost anything. So
not
why
to put
would
it
they
online.
Why would they stop doing it?
I think I see the problem here. The argument isn't that they stop releasing open source. It's that open source projects that are released stop being developed. That's specifically what the Fuhrer evidence says. That we need to continue to develop these sources to, for example, continue financial services in areas like Africa.
Look, that just doesn't make very much sense. Like, the reason that big companies make new algorithms is to help their own business, and then like maybe they put some of them online, but they're definitely initially developing them to help themselves.
Sure, so we would argue that they
and
still
if the cost of them putting online is nothing, then there's no reason that would change, like even if they lose money.
Well, like I can give you an example. Like right now, Microsoft has released about 60,000 patents that are open source. We would argue that those patents or those like programs that those patents are going into don't continue to develop the innovation that's happening, and that's what costs them money. Could I ask you a question?
I mean, that doesn't make very sense. Sure.
Okay, sure. We'll talk about it later in speech. So, what is the solvency on your side for getting more startups? Is it breakups?
It's just generally that companies can't engage in anti-competitive practices, which could mean breakups, could mean unfair mergers, could mean like bad buyouts that threaten to copy them and undervalue them. It's any of those things.
So it's like everything antitrust does, correct? You're not going to pin down to one like advocacy of what antitrust does.
I mean, antitrust does a lot of things.
Sure. So
can I ask you a question?
Go for it.
Okay. So your argument about poverty in Kenya.
Yep.
So the way that you read it in case is you say that open source is helping a lot of people escape poverty.
Yeah.
But your evidence says that like mobile phones help people escape poverty.
No. So it is mobile money services developed from apps that are open source code. That's the argument. It's Microsoft releasing mobile money services in developing nations. That is the code that is allowing them to learn financial literacy and get our poverty.
So
can I get one more question?
So it's that Microsoft is releasing the. Okay, so it's specifically Microsoft is releasing code.
They have released code
to these two companies in Kenya.
Yes, and they're continually developing. That's why there are 2 billion people that can still be impacted.
Yeah,
cool. So let's talk about your impact, right?
Yep.
You talk about how innovation happens. So how much innovation do startups create right now?
Not very much because they are being crushed.
Sure.
But we would argue that if you return to times like the 20th century, they would create the majority of innovation when antitrust was properly enforced. That's time.
Okay.
We'll take that.
Wait, can we see the Kenya evidence where it like uses the word open source anywhere?
Yeah, there's 2 of them that do that talk about the same thing. Here, I'll pull up both of them. Yeah, let me grab this. Madison. So Madison is the one I just handed you. The IFMA also says, quote, open source in the very first line.
Thanks, Valentine's. Yes. And my judges? Great. Let's begin. So before I get into my opponent's case, let's recognize something very important, that there's two types of innovation. There's disruptive innovation and incremental innovation. We will argue, as the economist evidence in our case also does and substantiates, that the types of innovation that our opponents talk about from big technology companies are incremental. They're bells and whistles. It's a new iPhone. But the types of innovation that startups do are disruptive. They're industry changing. It's the invention of the Mac. This matters because the O'Sullivan evidence in our case explains that, quote, innovation is a key driver of economic growth. American growth has been underpinned by disruptive innovations. Think of Ford and the assembly line, which revolutionized manufacturing, or Apple, which created the first Mac. Disruptive innovations have a much bigger impact on economic growth than incremental innovations. Let's go to my opponent's arguments. Their whole case is about breaking these companies, harming open source. Let's start with how they say this is going to happen. The first one is that they say there's going to be politically motivated lawsuits, but this doesn't really make a lot of sense. First, because we say in our case with the New York Times evidence that these lawsuits really haven't mattered for much, because we've seen 15 lawsuits that used to be brought against the tech companies, but only 3 per year now. So these lawsuits clearly aren't doing much. But I would say that even more so, it doesn't matter if the lawsuits are politically motivated or by rival firms. If they're by rival firms, that's probably because the big tech companies are disadvantaging them. The more important consideration that's rounded is if we can show these big tech companies are being anti-competitive, which they clearly are by killing startups. And then their second argument talks about increasing investor uncertainty, and we totally agree with this. Investors will invest less in big tech companies once they're broken up. But we think that this is a good thing because it makes way for startups. Give the example of Microsoft. They say that post-Microsoft, there was a decrease in investment. But Charles Duhigg, the author we cite in our case, writes, quote, as the government sued Microsoft, the executives became so anxious and gun-shy that they essentially undermined their own monopoly out of terror that they might be pillared again. Duhigg explains this allowed a small company to rise that we know today as Google, that before the Microsoft case, Google could not have risen because Microsoft had a total monopoly. But after the case, Google had the ability to rise. Now let's go to their big argument about open source data. There's a lot of overall issues with this argument before I get into their impacts. The first one is that the data is already released. If these companies put the data on open source platforms, it doesn't matter if we break the companies up because it's already open source. The definition of this argument suggests that it's not a problem. And they concede in Crossfire, as my partner asked them, that putting the programs themselves online doesn't cost any money. So our opponents need to explain what the change is when you enforce antitrust insofar as to seem to there's one. But two, the problem is this is a lot more of a marketing campaign than a real tool. Hoffman in 2017 explains that, quote, many open source projects seem to suffer from a slow development pace where new versions are endlessly delayed, new features come out slowly if ever, and it's difficult to prioritize difficult but important features. That's really important because it tells us that big tech companies aren't just shielding their better data, and it makes logical sense. Google or Apple wants to give themselves the advantage, not small businesses. They're giving these companies the scraps. If these, now let's go to their impacts. So, there's a couple issues with their argument about small businesses. The first one is their statistic where they say that 78% of small businesses rely on this data. That's not what it says. It says that 70% of small businesses sometimes use and partially rely on open source data. That's very different. It means that open source data is not very important to these companies, and for good reason. Because we're probably talking about tech companies. Like a mom and pop restaurant is not using Google's open source AI code. What we're really talking about is tech startups, which is our field. Tech startups have to be able to compete with the big tech companies, but it doesn't help them for a couple of reasons. First, Wheeler explains that even though the open source software is enabled, the algorithms, the data that powers those algorithms are kept under lock and key by the big tech companies. For example, even if I know how Facebook works, it doesn't help me if I don't have any of the data that powers Facebook, if I don't have anyone's contact information. But two, according to Duhigg, even furthermore, he explains that even if these companies were to acquire the software, the big companies will just use things like patent protection to prevent them from using the open source access. That is why the evidence in our case indicates that startup formation is at an all-time low. Finally, on their impact about the developing world, this argument, they don't explain the link, because the mobile services payment that they're talking about, which is what we asked about in Crossfire, the evidence says, quote, even though they're mobile service payments, most people in these countries don't even have a bank account, which means that they can't access the mobile service payments, and furthermore, it says the open source payments aren't doing enough to help them. We would say that actually startups are the better way to do this, because startups can innovate and bring open source payments to them a lot faster. Thank you, and please affirm today's resolution.
We'll start.
All right.
Starting from
We can start fresh.
Start from. Taking your notes.
Alright. Can I grab that? It's going to start off on our case, responding to their attacks, and then we'll flip over and attack techniques. Everyone ready? Start off with a little observation that they read about incremental innovation versus disruptive innovation. At the point where they win, small businesses will completely concede this, but this is just an extension of their case. They have to win their case to get this argument. With that said, extend the inherency evidence from Lowry in 2019 that it goes undisputed. It tells you that big tech is the sole driver of open source technology because they have the capital to do so. At that point, we control uniqueness to the link. They concede the fact that small businesses can't do that. Then get into our links. First, on our link about settlements, they say that there was only 15 suits last year. That's our whole point. When enforcement happens, it ramps up. That's the McAfee and 04 evidence, which you can extend. It says that there is a swarm of private plaintiffs. That's because they have backing from the federal government and know they can win in court. That's where the draining of capital effect comes from, so you can go for that. But the second is about decreasing investment. They concede this link flat out. Every single case drops investment to $1.7 billion. We'll get into why that doesn't actually help small businesses on their case. The final thing they say is that in the example of Microsoft, they got split up and that allowed Google to expand. Pet Caucus in 2018 directly disputes this. He says that Google was already a company and was already scaling up before this ever happened. There's no actual causal link, it's just correlation. Then, on the Rowley evidence, this is really crucial to our link. It tells you that if companies don't have access to excess capital, they don't create open source. You can group both of their responses. What they say here is that things are already released and that market data exists. The important thing here is that data is not about the amount of data you have, but instead how you use it. That's why small companies can be extremely good at open source. Their case even tells you this. The other thing they say is that it's already been released, but understand this stuff has to be updated. That's exactly what Rowley says. They have to keep continuing development. For example, small companies can't succeed if they're using Windows 98. They have to be using the newest stuff. That gives us access to both impacts. First, on small businesses, they say our card doesn't say it's important to small businesses. That's not true. Call for the card. The second thing, on poverty, it's the biggest impact in the round. They say that people don't have bank accounts. Look to our evidence, though. It says that right now the status quo is on track to get 2 billion people out of poverty in developing countries. Even if their claim is true, the people that we can impact should be impacted. Don't change the status quo on their case. Start off on their sole contention about innovation. The first thing they say is that right now startups are failing and that it's really inefficient. There's a huge issue with this. Take them out on inherency. The ITIF in 2017, they do a meta-analysis of 5 million small businesses over the past decade. You value this study, one, because it has a larger sample size than the anecdotal examples that they give you, but on top of that, because it covers a larger range, so it can show you the actual trends. With that, they find that there has been no decrease in the amount of startups being started. But what they do find, and it's really critical, is that the success of these startups has actually risen. That's really critical because all of their impacts only happen when small businesses succeed. 2 warrants for this. The first is from Nagel in 2017 from our case. It says that when you offer open source technology, it gives small companies a leg up. That's because keep in mind that small businesses are operating on razor-thin margins. They don't have the capital, and this decreases overhead costs. But moreover, the OIN in 2019 finds that Google or Microsoft just released 60,000 patents. That's all of their patents to small businesses to help them thrive. That doesn't happen when you vote affirmative. Then, the second link, though, comes from Delgado in 2017, which finds that companies like Amazon are giving small businesses access to a global market, which is why Brown in 2018 terminally quantifies that 1.9 million small businesses only exist because big companies are giving them the opportunity. That outweighs. Then they say that startups can't compete. You can turn this against them from Murray in 2019. He finds that venture investment in small businesses would heavily decrease in their world. That's because venture capitalists invest in small businesses even though they're risky because they can get a quick return on investment when a company is bought up. That goes away in their world. That's why Murray concludes that there would be no investment in small companies. The final thing they say, they give this example about AT&T. It's really critical because this is the linchpin of their case. They don't give any real warranting about specific enforcement. They just rely on this AT&T example. The issue is there's a huge alternate cause to their example. The internet was exploding at this time. All of the companies and innovation that was happening was already going to happen regardless. That's why even in the example of AT&T, it ties back into our case. They settled. There's still one company right now. Thus, we negate.
Is everyone ready? Great. So I want to clarify something about open source. So you contend that only big technology companies can develop and release open source. right? But,
Yes.
but we've already established that it doesn't cost money to release the open source, right? It
No.
costs money to develop a program
The
that then you
cost
make
is
open source, right?
developing, exactly.
Okay, great. Just I want to clarify that. So one more thing. So if we can win that startups and small businesses will create better programs than the big tech companies, then they'll also be able to release those open source, right?
The issue with that argument is that our case is a prerequisite. These startups create the innovation that you're talking about by using open source. They build their innovation upon open source. That's our entire case. Do you mind if I have a question?
Wait, sorry, that didn't answer my question. My question was, if we're debating about the importance of open source technology, and we're debating about, so why can't small tech startups, if they make a better device or product or service, why can't that also be open source?
They never have the chance to if they don't have open source technology to get a
Well,
leg
but
up in a highly
sorry,
competitive field.
But why would it
Can
go
I-
away?
Why?
The existing
why would it
open
go
source
away?
doesn't go away.
No, exactly. That's why we give you the warranting, and Rowley really well addresses this. It says that we have to continue development, right? If you're using old software, you can't actually compete. Like, we can both agree that technology is like an ever-changing field.
Sure.
With the most recent innovation,
Yeah.
that's the only way that small businesses compete. That's why open source is the unique link into helping them. Can I get a question now?
Sure,
Okay.
sure.
So on your case, you say that like innovation is really gonna boost. So like what studies do you cite that says innovate or like the innovation or small business creation is down right now?
Sure, that's the Schechter evidence. It says that it's at a 40-year low.
It's at a 40-year low, right? And what's the date on that?
I can pull it up, but I don't have the date right now. But I can show it to you.
All
right
right,
now. So
perfect.
it's
we can
quite
take a look at it
recent.
after cost.
Actually, do you mind if I ask you about your evidence?
Just
about
one
the
follow
ITM?
up to that.
Sure.
Can we agree that your impact about innovation and economic growth only happens with a company that succeeds? Not just increasing the creation of startups, but to create long-term growth, we have to have these companies succeed. Can we agree with that?
The startups would need to make good innovations, yes.
Okay. You have a question.
And historically they have.
Yeah.
So I want to ask about your evidence. So you claim that startups' growth has not actually declined, and you cite the ITIF. Who funds the ITIF?
I mean, there's a couple of sources. I think you're going to say
Who's the big
Google
funder?
is. Right,
Google.
right.
Doesn't that
you
kind
can
of
say that.
undermine
Hold
the
on.
credibility of
Hold
that
on.
source?
I'd say you're disregarding the warranting. Let's say you don't want to buy the card, right? Like, look at the other, like, look at the, like, the, like, sorry, look at the,
We'll answer your warrants.
look
I'm
at
just
the
asking about quality
methodology
evidence.
behind the study, right?
I
Like,
would-
what's really important, if you want to indict the card, show a flaw with it. Don't just say that they have some money from Google.
Would you
show
trust
a flaw.
a study on the health effects of tobacco from the tobacco industry?
I mean, maybe not, but if they had good methodology on it and they were fair about it,
So
then yeah.
I haven't read the full ITIF study, but what I have read is authors that explain that the ITIF is an unreliable source. Because
Alright.
anyone who takes money from a company is going to have incentives to make profit.
I can see that, and if you can give an actual like instant, like if you can provide a similar study of similar rigor that says the opposite thing, then we could say that maybe they see their results.
That's the
Because you
trick.
have this. Alright, yeah, can we see that?
There you go.
Sorry, no.
Here you go.
Thank you.
Then,
And now we'll run some back.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Can we very quickly see the Kenya evidence, the 2 billion evidence?
yeah.
Oh, wait, 20 seconds.
Thank you.
important issue in this round is making sure that future innovations are disruptive innovations. Even if you believe everything that my opponents say and that big tech companies innovate more, remember those are incremental innovations, things that change the minors. But our innovations are disruptive, one that change the face of the economy and brings billions of dollars of benefits. But two, it also means we win their arguments. Because if you greatly expand the scope of the economy and have better innovation, that means that open source data can also be released to more people. They don't tell you why small businesses can't just release their data open source. Let's look how we win this. What we tell you on our case is that the issue with big companies is that they're very bureaucratic. And if I'm a big company, it's very hard to get a good idea through because there's always people who are trying to shoot me down. However, when you break up these big companies, that means that every single idea will have the chance to flourish. Sure, some will fail, but all the good ones will at least have a chance to succeed. That is why every single time you saw a breakup of big tech, whether it be AT&T, or IBM, there's always better innovation. Let's look at their responses. First, they say that startups are going up right now. That evidence, remember, is funded by big tech. You should probably check your evidence, which says that it's decreased by 40%. Then go to their next response, which is that small businesses, that there's an incentive for venture capitalists because they want to get bought out, but that can't happen unless there's big tech. There's two problems with that. One is that big tech companies will either threaten to buy small businesses and copy them and offer them lower prices, or two, they will copy them outright. That means that the payoff for venture capitalists in my opponent's roles right now is far lower than it should be, which is why venture capital is down. In fact, the Economist finds that venture capital has decreased by 22% in the past few years. Then, on their argument about AT&T, we have conflicting evidence. Our evidence says specifically that AT&T led to the birth of the internet because of the breakup, but we should probably refer our warranted analysis. Then, on their argument about open source, they dropped Daniel's response from Hoffman, which is that it doesn't matter that even if algorithms are open source, what matters is not the algorithms, but having data. And insofar as companies like Facebook and Google are not releasing their data to the world, it doesn't matter if I have good algorithms because I need the data to perfect those algorithms. Finally, on their Kenya evidence, it just doesn't say it's lifting 2 billion people out of poverty. It says 2 billion people don't have internet. Shouldn't vote for them anyways. Thank you.
Alright, we'll start our prep now.
Sorry, can we stop prep for 1 minute? Can we see like the causal evidence that said AT&T was the reason?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Thanks. Alright, so Guys, then keep running.
Okay, okay.
And the second one we use.
Me too. It'll start on their case and move to ours. Is everyone ready? Let's start off with the ITIF term. They make two responses. First, they say that our evidence is funded by big tech, but they don't even engage with the warrants, which is what they said that they would do. That's where you can extend both warrants. Obviously, there's a methodology to the study. If they don't engage with how they came to the conclusion of the sample size, then they shouldn't get the access towards the d-link on the term. That means you can extend the Nagel evidence, which says that open source is giving small businesses access towards a lot of new innovations that helps them grow, but also the Delgado evidence, which says that big tech companies are giving other small companies a platform which allows them grow as well. This means that you prefer our analysis because one, it's a larger sample size, and two, it's a larger time frame. All they say is that you should prefer their evidence. Their card is from 1970. It analyzes from 1970 till 2016. We'd say that it's far overblown and it's not an accurate time frame to evaluate the round down. Then on alternate causality, they say that they have warranted arguments for why AT&T was breaking up, but they don't give you the warrants. We do. Jackson tells you in his speech that because the internet was exploding at that time, there was a lot of companies happening. In fact, their own card says that things like the modem and internet innovation was the reason for why all these startups happened. Their own evidence takes out the AT&T example. With that in mind, let's go to our case. Extend the Lowry evidence. It explicitly says that big tech is the one that is driving this innovation and things like open source software. That gives us access towards the investment link, which they cold concede in the last speech, which says that every single case of antitrust litigation decreases investment by $1.7 billion. That means you give us access to the McAfee evidence. The only thing they say here is that data is not going to be enough. But Jackson responds to this in his rebuttal. He says that Microsoft has released 60,000 patents right now. Obviously, they're not hiding their data. In fact, they're increasing it. And if anything, we would say with hiding their data, they're still allowing small businesses to succeed. That means you extend the Rowley evidence, which says that when these companies have a shortcut of data, they have to put open source on the chopping block. On the impact of 2 billion people, all they say is that these people the card says 2 billion people get access to the internet. The card literally says that you give 2 billion people in developing nations access to basic financial services that helps them get into a better financial position. Do impact weighing here. There is not a single quantifiable confirmed impact on their side, but when you negate the resolution, you know for sure 2 billion people are pulled out of poverty in the developing world. Thus we negate.
So what do patents cover?
Patents, innovation.
Yeah, sure, yeah, innovations on new products, right?
Sure.
That's not the same thing as data, right?
We would say that data is like things like information, right? So patents give out information, Jackson.
Right.
No,
so
no,
they're two very different things.
Hold on. So like on top of that, even if you don't buy patents, things like AI software, like Google's HiveMind, that's all open source.
So are you conceding that patents is not a legitimate argument? Or?
No.
We're saying that patents are also helping to contribute to the success of small businesses.
Look, releasing a patent is great. All our argument is that is small potatoes compared to the data. Because it's one thing to have a machine that the patents give, right, and have a machine that has algorithms, which is what the open source code gives.
Mm-hmm.
But it's another thing to have the data that the machine
Sure.
We don't have access to that.
You can make the argument that data is not being released, but the problem is that right now, small businesses are still succeeding on a larger sample size, right?
Yeah. Okay.
Wait,
Hold on.
That's
On
not
your
true.
data, we respond to this though. Hold. Just one thing.
Yeah.
We talk about Google HiveMind and other AI initiatives. Google has released the data. It's putting it in the hands of small businesses and allowing them to
When you say
contribute.
that Google has released data, like your response in rebuttal was that it's not about the amount of data, it's how they use it, but our response, like that still wasn't a response. We said that
Right. You put that along with patents.
Yeah, and again, like our argument's about data, it's not about patents. Are just like your
Right. We're saying that
rights to
both
make
are
something.
released. That information for patents.
You read evidence that said that companies are releasing data.
Yes, we can give you that if you want.
We can give you that evidence too, but also, even if everything you're saying is true, right now, small businesses are succeeding and are having higher success rates and formation rates because of things like open source.
According to whom?
I mean, again, look, like we have conflicting evidence, and ours are still probably preferable because it's not funded by tech startups.
Well, we have one card
give you-
that gives a study, and then 2 warrants from other credible authors that back up that study.
Like we also give warrants, which have
Sure.
not really been responded to, which is
Well,
that
which
big
weren't really
companies are.
extended either, right? Like you said
No,
that
no,
there's
they
a
were.
warranted example for
They-
AT&T, but you don't give me a warrant
No,
to.
we do. We
in
said
the
that
front
we said that big companies are bureaucratic and it's hard to get good ideas through them. When you're smaller companies, all of the good and bad ideas are spread out. Some bad ones fail, but at least all of them have a chance to succeed. That's something
Okay.
they responded to.
Does your AT&T empiric say that AT&T was stifling innovation because there was bureaucratic things going on?
It became apparent in retrospect just how much innovation the Bell system AT&T monopoly had been holding back.
Right, it
Out
also
of the
said-
carcass of AT&T emerged new types of industries unimagined before.
Sure, it
Right,
also says
and
that things like modem and innovation and internet was the reason for why all these
Can
startups
I
happened.
ask about the modem?
Sure.
What is the modem? It connects to a phone, right?
Sure.
Before the AT&T monopoly, did AT&T let modems connect to phones?
You want to tell me?
They didn't. That's what the monopoly led to. It led to the creation of modems, which led to the internet.
Sure. So you're saying that because AT&T let people connect their cell phones to modems,
Wait, not
hundreds of
Starbucks.
startups were created. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that is exactly what.
So because like I can go home one day after the AT&T suit goes in and I can plug my phone in, it's all yeah.
Alright, could we see the data?
Yeah. Do you have the Highland?
Yeah, let me pull that up.
Okay, that's fine.
Oh, no.
Yep. Okay. All right. Now ready? Opponents and my judges. Great. Let's begin. The most important issue in this round is encouraging disruptive innovation, the kind of innovation that changes entire industries and that drives American growth. Our opponents have agreed to this. The only disagreement is between the innovation argument and the open source argument. But it shouldn't be a disagreement. They drop what Noah says in summary, which is that if innovation gets better, if these companies can develop better systems and better platforms, then open source also gets better. There is no barrier to these small startups making these data public. They don't make an argument against this. The only barrier is creating the programs themselves. So if we win that startups create better innovations than these big tech companies and better platforms, then we also win their open source argument and all of their impacts. Here's how we win that startups do this better. What we say is that the growth of big technology companies has killed startups in the crib. And the reason why is because of what Noah says, is that if any startup tries to challenge them, the big tech company will say one of two things. Either we're going to buy you at a price much lower than what you want, or we're going to copy all of your features. That is why we're seeing a 40-year low of startup development. Even if, a 40-year low of startup development, that only leaves big companies. And our economist evidence explains big companies are much worse at disruptive innovation because there's so much bureaucracy. It's much harder to get my idea through if I have to talk to one person than if I have to talk to 5 or 20. So as a company grows and grows, it's harder to make new disruptive innovations. Our opponents make a couple of responses. First, they say that you give access to capital and platforms to grow. These may be true, but they don't weigh this argument against our arguments. Our arguments are more important. Even if I get bought out by Google and I have more money, if no one at Google listens to my ideas because there's more bureaucracy, my innovation doesn't matter. Our economist warrant should come before their warrant, because even if they win and these companies get more money, it doesn't matter if the money doesn't go towards valuable projects. So our warrants outweigh theirs. Our warrants also outweigh theirs, because if these startups can't get funded by venture capital in the first place, they also can't get bought out. And they drop what we say, that there's been a 22% decrease in venture capital funding, killing startups and killing innovation. The other reason why you shouldn't vote for our opponents is because they're not actually increasing open source data through big tech companies. What we say is that big tech companies release the software, but not the data, which is critical for companies to develop. That is why their own evidence about Africa and Kenya just says that 2 billion people lack access and are not getting it. Big tech is not serving their needs. We need to break them up. Thank you. Please affirm the resolution.
All right, we'll start up. Going to start off on the F and then flip over to the neck. Everyone ready? The argument that they continually extend is that they are going to create more innovation that is disruptive. It's really non-responsive to the ITIF in 2017. They try to write it off because Google had some part in funding it. But what they don't respond to is the warranting that we give. That's really important, because even if you disregard the ITIF, we give you 2 really good reasons to believe that big tech is helping small companies. The first is about open source. Nagel in 2017, along with the OIN in 2019. They say that not only is Microsoft releasing out 60,000 patents, all of their patents specifically to help small businesses, but they're also giving them the platform to succeed. That's why Brown in 2018 internally quantifies that 1.9 million small businesses exist solely because companies like Amazon are giving them the platform. That goes unresponded to, so even if you don't buy the ITIF, don't write off the warranting behind it. Then go down to their impacts. Even if you buy their whole innovation argument, don't give them this round because of the impact warning that Arunab does that goes unresponded to. They don't extend a quantifiable impact. They just say disruptive innovation, but they don't tell you what that actually looks like in their world. That's why our impacts are far preferable. Even a marginal impact outweighs on something that you don't even know what you're voting for. That flips over to our side and gives us the sole voter of the negative. That's on open source technology. They concede the inherency from Lowry in 2019 that says where the big tech is the only one that can do it. Then they concede the link from Bittling-Meyer in 01. It says that every single case causes a loss of $1.7 billion, and that gives us access to the Rally in 2017 evidence, which tells you that right now, companies are, if they lose the capital, the excess capital, they won't be able to support open source technology. Keep in mind the argument here. The idea is that they have to keep developing the source. That all open source software doesn't go away overnight, but it doesn't stay up to date, and that's why we get access to the impact of poverty. The only thing they say is that our evidence doesn't actually say what it does. Let's read it. Current data from the World Bank shows that nearly 2 billion people in developing economies lack bank accounts and miss out on the benefits of security and basic financial services brought. But what they miss is that it says that these programs of open source are providing these things to these people. That's our solvency. It's very simple. It's the only quantifiable impact, thus we negate.